Part 2. The first time I pressed play. I didn't have a cassette player. Nobody does anymore. So I drove to 3 different thrift stores before I found an old boombox, dusty and covered in stickers from bands that broke up before I was born. The man at the counter tested it for me, and it worked, the wheels turning with a soft mechanical hum, the little orange power light blinking on like a tired eye. That night, I sat on the floor of my apartment with the boombox in front of me, the tape already loaded inside. My hands were shaking a little, which felt strange for something so small. It was just a tape, probably an old mixtape, or maybe my mother reading me a bedtime story from when I was small. She used to record herself reading books for me when I was a baby, so I could hear her voice even when she worked late nights at the hospital where she was a nurse for almost 30 years. I pressed play. At first, there was only static, the hiss of old tape running through old machinery, that gray sound like rain on a tin roof. Then, slowly a voice came through. My mother's voice. Soft, warm, exactly as I remembered it, down to the small catch she always had in her throat when she was about to say something important. "Sarah," the voice said, "my sweet girl, if you're listening to this, then I'm already gone, aren't I? I'm sorry. I wanted more time. I always wanted more time with you." I started crying immediately. It felt like a gift, like she had left me one more conversation hidden away from me to find when I needed it most. The voice continued, talking about small things, how proud she was of me, how she remembered the day I was born, how the nurses had let her hold me for almost an hour before anyone made her put me down, how she hoped I would find someone who loved me the way she had once loved my father before things went wrong between them. It was beautiful. It was exactly what a grieving daughter would want to hear. It felt like being wrapped in a blanket that had just come out of the dryer, warm all the way through. The tape ran for about 10 minutes before it clicked off on its own, the reels stopping with a soft thud. I sat there in the dark for a long time afterward, holding the boombox like it was a living thing, replaying her words in my head, hearing her voice again and again in my memory. I listened to it 3 more times that night. Each time, it felt like a hug from beyond the grave. I fell asleep on the floor of my living room with the boombox still sitting beside me, the small orange light glowing in the dark like a tiny lantern, and for the first time since the funeral, I slept without dreaming. Part 3. Something is different. The next evening, I wanted to hear her voice again. I made tea, sat on the floor in the same spot, and pressed play, already smiling before the static even started, already bracing myself to cry the good kind of tears. The static came first, just like before. Then her voice. But something was wrong. "Sarah," the voice said, "my sweet girl, did you sleep well last night? You always used to toss and turn when you were anxious about something. I could always tell, even when you were a teenager and thought you were hiding it from me." I froze, my tea cooling in my hands. I had tossed and turned the night before. Actually, no, wait, I had fallen asleep on the floor, deeply, dreamlessly, the best sleep I'd had in weeks. That didn't match. But more than that, the tape from the night before hadn't mentioned anything about sleep at all. It had talked about my birth, about my father, about hoping I found someone to love me. This was a different conversation entirely, a new one, layer on top of the old one like a second coat of paint. I told myself I was misremembering. Grief does strange things to memory. Maybe I had just forgotten a section. Maybe the tape was longer than I thought, and I hadn't listened all the way through the first time, and this was simply a part one had missed. The voice continued. "I know you found the wooden box in the attic. I know you drove to 3 stores looking for something to play me on. You always were stubborn like that. Even as a little girl, remember the time you refused to wear a coat in the snow because you wanted to prove you weren't cold? Do you remember the blue dress you wore to your 5th birthday party? You cried because it had a stain on it, and I told you nobody would notice, and you didn't believe me, and you sulked in the corner for 20 minutes until your father bribed you with cake. I did remember that dress. I hadn't thought about it in 20 years, hadn't thought about it since it happened, actually. And yet the memory came rushing back whole and complete the second the voice mentioned it, like a door swinging open onto a room I'd forgotten existed. And I definitely, absolutely had not told anyone that I had visited 3 thrift stores to find a boombox. I hadn't even told my best friend that specific detail. I had only said I'd found an old player somewhere. There was no way my mother could have recorded that information before she died. There was no way anyone could have known that unless they were watching me, right now in real time. My hands went cold. The tape clicked off again, exactly 10 minutes in, same as before, the click sounding almost polite, like a door closing gently instead of slamming. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake in bed with all the lights on, staring at the boombox sitting silently on my dresser, feeling like it was staring back, the way you can feel someone watching you from across a dark room, even when you can't see their eyes. Part 4. I try to explain it away. In the morning, sunlight helps. It always does. Fear that feels enormous at 3 in the morning shrinks down to something manageable once the sun comes up and the birds start making noise outside your window and the world remembers to be ordinary again. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the tape had multiple tracks and the player was randomly choosing which one to play, like a shuffle feature on an old machine that malfunctioned in some strange way. Maybe I had told someone about the thrift stores and forgotten, and that person had somehow... No, that didn't make sense either. Nobody could record onto an old cassette tape and place it inside a sealed box in an attic that hadn't been touched in years, matching my private thoughts and unspoken memories word for word. I called my mother's old friend, Denise, a woman who had known her since college, back when they used to share an apartment above a laundromat and split the rent by counting quarters at the kitchen table. I asked if she knew anything about a cassette tape my mother might have recorded before she died, maybe as some kind of final gift. Denise sounded confused. She said my mother hadn't mentioned anything like that. Not once, and besides, my mother had been in the hospital for the last 6 weeks of her life, far too sick and far too heavily medicated to be organizing secret recordings, let alone smuggling a wooden box up into an attic she could barely climb stairs to reach anymore. That should have scared me more than it did. Instead, some strange, hopeful part of me wanted to believe it really was magic. That my mother had found some way to reach me from beyond, to keep talking to me, to keep being my mother even after death, defying every rule of biology and physics just to stay a little longer in my life. Grief makes you want to believe in impossible things. It makes the impossible feel like comfort instead of danger, like a door left open instead of a trap sprung shut. That afternoon, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went to the library and looked through old newspaper archives for our town, searching for anything about strange recordings, haunted objects, families losing loved ones under odd circumstances. It felt silly even as I typed the search terms into the microfilm computer. Most of what came up was nothing. Obituaries, church bake sale announcements, a decades-old article about a house fired 2 streets over from where my mother used to live. But one small clipping caught my eye. It was from almost 40 years ago, barely 2 paragraphs long, buried on page 9 of a local paper that didn't exist anymore. The headline read, "Local woman's death ruled accidental after months of strange behavior." The article was thin on details, the kind of vague small-town reporting that leaves more questions than answers. But it mentioned a woman named Eleanor Voss who had, according to neighbors, become withdrawn and obsessed with an old recording in the months before she was found dead in her home. No cause of death was listed. The article ended abruptly. as if the reporter had been told to stop asking questions. I stared at that clipping for a long time. I told myself it meant nothing. Coincidences happen. Old towns have old tragedies, dozens of them, buried in every issue of every dead newspaper. But I wrote down the name anyway, Eleanor Voss, on a scrap of paper I folded into my pocket, and I didn't throw it away for a long, long time. I decided to listen again that night. I told myself I needed to understand it, to know what it was before I could decide whether to be afraid. I think, really, I just wasn't ready to stop hearing her voice yet, and I was looking for permission to keep listening. Part 4.5, the house on Larkspur Street. Before that, though, curiosity got the better of me one more time. I found the old address listed for Eleanor Voss in a city directory from decades ago, and I drove past it on my lunch break the next day, telling myself I was just being thorough, just closing a loop, nothing more. The house was still standing, a narrow 2-story with faded blue siding, a chain-link fence around a yard gone to weeds. It looked ordinary, sad, maybe the way old houses look when nobody has loved them in a long time, but ordinary. An old man was raking leaves next door, moving slowly, the way people move when their bodies have started arguing with them. I parked and walked over, feeling foolish before I even opened my mouth, and asked if he'd known the woman who used to live in the blue house. He stopped raking. He looked at me for a long moment, the way you look at someone when you're deciding how much truth they can handle. His name was Walter, and he told me he'd lived on that street his whole life, 71 years, and that he remembered Eleanor Voss the way you remember a storm that passed close to your own house without quite touching it. He said she'd been a normal woman once, cheerful, always waving from her porch, always bringing over extra vegetables from her garden. Then, in the last year of her life, something changed. She stopped coming outside during the day. Her lights would be on at strange hours, 3, 4 in the morning, and Walter's late wife used to hear, very faintly across the yard on quiet nights, the sound of a woman talking to someone in an empty room. Talking like a conversation, he said, leaning on his rake. Back and forth. Except there wasn't ever anybody else in that house with her. Not after her husband passed. Just her and the girl. I asked about the girl. Margaret. Walter's face did something complicated, somewhere between sadness and something older and more careful than sadness. She stopped going to school, he said. Then Eleanor was gone. Found her in the kitchen one morning. They said, though nobody in this neighborhood ever believed the official word on how it happened. And the girl, he shook his head slowly. The girl was gone before the funeral. Family came and took her, people said, relatives from out of state. I never saw her again after that, and neither did anybody else on this street. Not once, not in 71 years. You'd think a person would come back, even once, to visit a grave. She never did, or maybe she never could. I thanked him and walked back to my car on legs that didn't feel entirely like my own, and I did not sleep well that night, long before the tape ever spoke to me about it directly. Something about the phrase, or maybe she never could follow me home and sat in the passenger seat the whole drive back, and has never quite gotten out of the car since.